Hello, this is Perry Dunlap, and I am going to be talking about Luke 5:33 to 39. That's the passage that I've chosen, and I'm just going to start by reading the passage, and then I'll start talking about it afterward. So, Luke 5:33 to 39, this is my own translation. And they said to him, the disciples of John fast often and offer prayers, and also the disciples of the Pharisees. But your disciples eat and drink. And Jesus said to them, Can you make the guests of the bridegroom fast when the bridegroom is with them? But the days will come when the bridegroom is taken from them, and then they will fast in those days. He also said a parable to them. No one tears a patch from a new garment and puts it on an old garment. If he does so, the new garment will tear, and the patch from the new garment will not match the old. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins, because if he does so, the new wine will burst, and the skins will be spilled, and the skins will be destroyed. Rather, the new wine must be poured into new wineskins, and no one after drinking the old wishes for the new, for he says the old is good. So the issue at stake here is a direct challenge to Jesus' authority as a pious person. But little did the Pharisees know, they were also challenging his deity, to which he also defended. In Luke, the issue over fasting is one of several instances where he began to first draw protests and rejections by the religious leaders. So it begins in 5:17, where he heals a paralyzed man, but first he forgives his sins, and then he dines with tax collectors, and he's lambasted for associating himself with those people. And then he continues with the passage that we're dealing with over the concept of fasting, and he ends with Jesus drawing the ire of the Pharisees over working and healing on the Sabbath. And so what begins in the beginning of the chapter with a mild protest ends with a murderous conspiracy to stop him. It escalates pretty quickly in this chapter, and this is kind of right in the middle of it. But where were these protests coming from? Is it a really big deal for Jesus and his disciples to not be fasting? Well, here we need to do some digging to find out just how important this ancient religious discipline was. Fasting was very important for the Jews of that day, as it had strong roots in remembering Jerusalem's destruction in Zechariah 7:3. The Day of Atonement in Leviticus 16:29. It was a general act of penitence in Isaiah 58:1-9, and also mourning. So fasting was also associated with apocalyptic revelation in 2 Esdras 5:13, and in Second Temple wisdom literature. It was very common for someone to fast before they received visions from the Lord. According to the TD&T, it had turned into a high mark of piety by the Pharisees. They would fast twice a week on Mondays and Thursdays, and this was clearly a big and important issue for anyone claiming to have a religious authority. It was not some marginal issue. It was seen as crazy that anyone could claim the authority and respect that Jesus did while eating and drinking continuously with tax collectors. And this is another note about Luke that's noteworthy, but he's the only one out of the three accounts of the story, which is in Matthew 9 and also Mark 2, where he's accused of eating and drinking. Because in the other ones it just says, Jesus, why don't you fast? Because these guys fast. This is the only time where he's accused of eating and drinking specifically. And this is a rhetorical device used by Luke to link his actions back to the previous passage, where he eats and drinks with tax collectors and sinners. So not only is he doing the unthinkable and eating and drinking with sinners, but he's doing so at the expense of this super important mark of religious piety. The Pharisees and the religious leaders would have been flabbergasted. And this is perhaps why Jesus' answer about fasting here doesn't reflect his discourse about fasting in Mark 6:16 in the Beatitudes. And he says there, And when you fast, don't look gloomy like the hypocrites, but when you fast, anoint your head and wash your face, so that your fasting may not be seen by others, but by your Father who is in secret. Right? So Jesus has nothing against fasting. He actually gives a description of how to fast correctly. But he's not answering a question of how to fast properly here. He's facing down an accusation of hypocrisy and impiety from the people who are asking him. So he doesn't just defend his actions, he talks about what fasting is for. And fasting isn't about a mark of piety, Jesus says. It's a purpose as an act of mourning, or longing and aching and waiting. So think about Anna, the prophetess, in Luke 2, where it says that she fasted and prayed daily at the temple, waiting in the redemption of Israel. Right? He says fasting is for mourning, but they shouldn't be mourning. Why? This is when he says, because the bridegroom has come. The bridegroom is here. And Here's where Jesus conjures up some important prophetic themes with this answer, because throughout the prophets, God often gives the metaphor of a bride and her lover to explain the relationship between Israel and Yahweh. So Isaiah 5:1, Isaiah 51, 5-7, Isaiah 62, 4-5, or Ezekiel 16, 6-8, or Hosea 2:19. Right, so Jesus' reference to the bridegroom in this moment is a clear statement of high Christology. Right, Jesus is essentially saying that the absence of fasting in his disciples is the display or the embodiment of God's presence with them. Right? There's no need to fast when you're celebrating. There's no need to fast when God is literally with you in the flesh. But then he says, but the days will come when the bridegroom will be taken away from them, and then they will fast in those days. And this marks the first time in Luke's gospel where he actually predicts his death. There will be a time when fasting is appropriate, but it will be when God's absence is felt again. Now, he could either be referring to the short period of time in between his death and resurrection, or after his resurrection entirely. Some scholars go both ways on it, but considering that the early church fasted, and that there's a lot in the New Testament to talk about the not yet part of eschatology, I think it's safe to say that Jesus is speaking of after the resurrection, which means that fasting is still something that's prominent for Christians to do today. So the final issue then is the two short parables he gives, presenting an old garment and old wineskins. If the old garment has a hole in it, right, you wouldn't patch it up with a new garment, or it would eventually shrink and tear, and the old wouldn't match the new. And if you were to place new wine in old wineskins, the wineskins would burst, and both would be ruined. This is where a lot of theology comes down to about the relationship between the Old and the New Testament, or Judaism and Christianity, or the Old and the New Covenants. Because what it would seem to be saying here is that the old wineskins is the Old Covenant, or the Old Dispensation, and Jesus is bringing the new one. So dispensationalists would say that Jesus here is referring not to the inferiority of the old, but rather the incompatibility of the old and the new. Right? Jesus brings a new dispensation, completely different and new from the old one, a clean break. But a hard supersessionist, on the other hand, would say that Jesus is saying the old is actually inferior, and now that the new wine/garment has come to replace it, right? It's replacing, it's covering it up. Now the old is obsolete. So think Hebrews, and the new is now here, and that's the new wine. Then how would you explain verse 39, which says, and no one after drinking the old wishes for the new, for he says the old is good. So here it seems like Jesus is giving preference to the old, and that would totally undercut the supersessionist claim. So I think the most reasonable thing to say here is that Jesus is bringing something new, but at the same time is not disparaging the old. Right? Luke's gospel is firmly rooted in Jewish antiquity. Jesus didn't come out of nowhere. He came from the prophecies of God's promises to Israel. Therefore, Jesus isn't coming to replace the old, right, or make a clean break from the old, but he's coming to fulfill it. Right? He's coming to fulfill it. The old is good. Jesus, as being a member of the Godhead, brought the old as well. And the reason that the old is so good is because it points to him. Joel Green makes an interesting interpretation on this, believing that in verse 39, what Jesus is really saying is he's using this common axiom or parable of saying that the old is good as basically saying, I'm the old wine, and you Pharisees and religious leaders, you guys are the new wine. You guys are the sour, nasty new wine that's not good because you're creating all these extra laws onto the old covenant. And I'm actually the old wine because old wine is better than new wine. And I'm the one that's firmly rooted in the promises of Israel, and you're not. And I think that theology is actually pretty on point, but I don't think that's exactly what's happening here, because in Matthew and Mark, it's very clear that Jesus is speaking of himself as the new wine. Verse 39 is unique to Luke, so I don't think he's saying something completely different than the other synoptics. He is the new wine. He's bringing something new. And he turns it back on the Pharisees in verse 39 by basically saying, you will never change your ways. You will always prefer the old because you've tasted the old and said that it was good. But Jesus brings a new covenant, a covenant that's written on the hearts and the minds of God's people, as Jeremiah says. And that is my work so far in Luke 5:33-39.